Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Futures Report for Wednesday the 9th of November. I'm Anthony Day. This week the United Nations Climate Conference COP27 opened and the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres set the tone with the warning that we are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak made a U-turn and decided to attend the conference after all. He turned up for the opening day but didn't stay long and took the opportunity to talk to President Macron of France about the migrant problem. He did make a speech. Some say it was the one written for Liz Truss when she was Prime Minister. Apparently his late decision to attend, made shortly after former Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced that he would be there, meant that Sunak's speech had to be shoehorned in at the end of the proceedings. Strangely, a speech from King Charles appeared on the agenda, but Sunak had effectively endorsed Liz Truss's decision to exclude him from the event, and instead the King hosted an event for climate leaders at Buckingham Palace a few days before COP27 started. Certainly Sunak doesn't have a reputation for being interested in the climate crisis. In fact, he still opposes onshore wind farms and supports the 100 or so applications for new licences for oil and gas exploration. The conference continues until the 18th of November, so there will be more on it in next week's episode and no doubt the week after. Today's episode brings you an interview with Zoe Cohen, who last spoke to the Sustainable Futures Report in 2019. Zoe is a concerned citizen who takes non-violent action to urge the government to take action to address the climate crisis. Our conversation was recorded on the 27th of October. We spoke about growth, about soup, sunflowers and mashed potato, about the unreality of net zero 2050, it's a joke, why you too should get arrested, and what you can do instead if you don't want to be. Zoe Cohen, welcome to the Sustainable Futures Report.
Hi, Anthony. Good to be back with you again. It's some time since we last spoke, I think.
2019.
Gosh, is it really that long? Wow.
Well, and quite a lot's happened since then. So, Zoe, you're a board-level coach, but you've had board-level appointments in large organisations. You've also had senior roles in the NHS in the past. And you say on your LinkedIn profile that your two passions are encouraging people to shine and to take action and safeguarding the future of our one shared planetary home. And there's an awful lot to do, I think, as far as that second one is concerned. But I want to talk particularly about growth. Growth has been in the news recently. Liz Truss, who some may remember as a Prime Minister, started off talking about the anti-growth coalition. Now, we're all familiar with the quotation where somebody said, anybody who believes in infinite growth on a finite planet is either an idiot or an economist. Mm-hmm. Now, I know you've been in the Twitter sphere recently, Zoe, talking very much about growth and sceptical, I think, of continued growth. Would you like to tell us a bit about your point of view?
Oh, thank you, Anthony. Yeah, I mean, gosh, where to start? There's so much to talk about, isn't there? Yeah, I mean, I'm fairly sure that most kids of secondary school age kids or probably younger, if you ask them, can you keep something growing forever on a finite Earth? They'd go, nah, of course you can't. It's like, it's obvious, isn't it? It's so obvious. And I guess intuitively, in some way, it's been obvious to me since I was quite young. Learning more and more about that, particularly in recent years, with things like the planetary boundary science. So not just carbon emissions, but all the planetary boundaries, land use, water, chemical pollution, etc., etc. And we've busted pretty much all the planetary boundaries now, or we're on the edge of busting them. And those that we haven't busted, that's usually because we haven't, the scientists haven't calculated the boundary yet, or they haven't done the analysis, but we've pretty much busted them all, haven't we? It's so obvious that we have to live within planetary boundaries. I mean, why does one even need to say it? But as you rightly said, to think you can keep on growing you're either bonkers or you're an economist. But you're not just an economist, Anthony. That's the thing. You're a certain type of economist, aren't you? You're a neoliberal, traditional inverted commas economist, who works within a certain set of models, and presumably as someone whose career and reputation and identity is associated with power and reputation that comes from that, as opposed to, ecological economists who would not agree with that at all.
All right. But the political message is that we need growth, because without growth, we cannot support the standard of living, the public services, the infrastructure that society needs. Basically, the politicians are saying without growth, we cannot rely on the public services and the standard of living that we've got used to. If we are saying that growth is impossible because there are planetary limits, does that imply that we are actually going to see a declining standard of living?
I think there's 3 or 4 things to say at least, isn't there? There's something about distribution of wealth that has to be said here, because of course the talk of growth is not a politically neutral thing, is it? It's not a neutral thing. It's loaded with politics and power. And when we scratch the surface of it, what they really mean is the rich need to get richer, because that's the people, that's us, and that's who we represent. I'm talking as a government here, those in power. Because what they mean is an utter obsession with GDP, gross domestic product. That's what they mean by growth, isn't it? That there is more and more economic activity, which equals profit for the rich predominantly. And we know, we know from established data that GDP growth massively disproportionately benefits the top 1%. Relatively a bit benefits the top 10%, and the rest of the population doesn't really benefit from GDP growth. So that's what this is really about. It's actually about GDP growth means inordinate increasing inequality, and relative inequality in society equals in unease at every level. Inequality harms all of us. It breaks down societal cohesion, it breaks down society, it breaks down community, it breaks down our physical and mental well-being. And at a global level, it breaks down the biosphere, because a tiny number of people have so much wealth, and obscene amounts of wealth. So that inequality is one of the key things at the heart of all of this. It's not the only thing, but it's one of the key things. So I'm probably going to plug a few people for listeners of this podcast to listen to. There's a guy called Gary Stevenson. I don't know if you've come across him, an ex-trader, young guy from London who's come from a working class background and became a trader, and got really rich really quickly because he's a very bright guy and he worked how to work the system. He still trades, but actually he's moved into a truth-telling space now, and some of his stuff's really worth listening to. And if you think, for example, we think about the money that the government pumped into the economy in COVID, the 600 billion, I think it was. Like, if you think, where's that gone? Well, the answer is it's accumulated in really rich people's hands, because I think it equated to something like 12 grand for every man, woman, and child, something like that in this country. But most people have got poorer, not richer. So where's that 12 grand gone? Well, it's accumulated in with really rich people who've gone and bought assets or gold or whatever with it, or put it into shares in horrific companies doing harm. So, that's what this government and most governments and the people who fund governments, lobby governments, buy governments, mean by growth. They mean the people in power get more powerful and richer, and everyone else is stuff.
Okay, all right. Before we get too far into the political sphere, you've identified inequality. That implies that to overcome the problem of inequality, we need redistribution, because what you're saying is growth is largely enjoyed by the elite, by the richest people.
Yeah.
If growth is not possible. If there is no growth, there is nothing to redistribute, is there? So how do we get over that problem?
Yeah, so I think, so this takes me to a really another important theme for me, which is about, let's just understand the difference between the economy and money and the real world.
Right, haven't got time for that.
Yeah, well, I'm not an economist, I'm not an expert, I'm a self-taught, I'm a self-taught postgraduate of different types of degrees, biological, social science, executive coaching and public health. So I've self-taught myself on the economic sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's super important at the most basic level for us to remember that the economy, inverted commas, is a social construct. It doesn't actually exist in, it's most of its numbers on spreadsheets, isn't it? I think 97% of money, in inverted commas, is debt and is therefore money on spreadsheets somewhere on mainframes. It's only 3% of money is actual coins and notes in circulation. So money largely doesn't exist. It's a promise isn't it, of in debt, which means it's promising something of the future, and it's demanding interest payments, which demand extraction. And what all of this stuff came out of originally, I guess we go back to, is how humans have traded. When we shifted from hunter-gatherers to agrarian societies and we began to have excesses, we were able to trade. So I've got loads of wheat, you've got more potatoes, let's trade. It's like, and we know in communities and with neighbours, we do that, don't we? We still do that. It's like I do it with my allotment neighbours and friends and so on. You got lots more courgettes, you can have some of my chilies. It's like, it's the same thing. Humans do that, and that's okay. But then our lives have just become overtaken by a neoliberal financialization of everything, and that's a completely different thing. Almost everything in our lives has become valued and monetized. Our attention on social media, etc., are the sites we visit. Everything has just been monetized the hell out of, hasn't it? Which is a completely different thing from trading your apples and your wheat and your potatoes. So the real economy is the trade and exchange and swapping and bartering of actual stuff, isn't it? It's stuff and labor. So, okay, I've got a skill, I can cut your hair or mow your lawn or something, and you'll make my dinner. Or, like goods and services trading that we need in a society. And we really benefit as people from all of this financialized unreal economy. It just strips the planet because it drives interest payment, interest-bearing debt, and companies and individuals have to extract more and more and more to pay that interest, and that goes back to the growth on a finite planet, and fundamentally also just not, of course, doesn't trickle down. Everything just flows upwards to the very rich and takes us back to where we started. So inequality is fundamentally inextricably linked, and also so is just the difference between a social construct and reality, and reality being the food, water, etc. that we actually need. Does that make any sense, Anthony? Have I made any sense there at all?
Oh, I think so. But look, is there a difference? Is there a difference between the service economy and the manufacturing economy? Because, for example, if somebody does mow your lawn and mows it several times, more times, you've got economic growth there, haven't you? But there's no resources actually involved apart from human labour.
Well, no, actually, what I would say is that example is actually part of the unpaid informal economy, of which there's lots and lots, isn't there? Like
Right.
People caring for each other, neighbours caring for each other, mums caring for their grandparents whilst looking after their children. The unpaid work, so much of which is done by women. That's a whole nother podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So we can have growth in care growth in informal unpaid work is beautiful and wonderful. So we need lots of lovely growth. We need growth in care. We need growth in education, most of which is very low carbon. We can
Of course,
indeed.
yeah. Education is paid work, and going to the theatre is paid work. So, but it's still service, and it's still got very little material resource input.
Nate Hagen, and Nate has got a coined a term in his work called energy blind, and about how intentionally or otherwise we have been socialized into a society and a system that we don't see the fact that our entire society and economy is based on energy, the vast majority of which is coal, oil and gas. We just don't see it. We've literally been brought up to be blinded by it, and I can almost feel the trolls coming on right now. It's like, the trolls that get on LinkedIn and just like, you can't stop oil, everything would, and in some ways they're right, because it does power everything, or mostly everything, because that's the way that society's gone. And let's face it, if we're honest, that's the way, particularly in the last 30 to 40 years, it's gone, in spite of the Shells and the Exxons and the BPs and the governments knowing the truth of where it was going to go. We all know, listening to this, I'm sure the Exxon knew stuff. They've known since the 80s, if not before, about what they were doing, and so have the US government and other governments. So they've done this in the knowledge of what it was going to do and the genocide it was going to cause, and they still are doing it.
Well, let's follow that thread, shall we? Because you have been an activist, you've been a protester, and very much in the news recently is Just Stop Oil. The latest thing they've done is thrown tomato soup over one painting and mashed potato over another. When I say a painting, an old master worth apparently millions of pounds or dollars or whatever you want to spend. So what's your view on that? Is that doing any good? Is that making anything happen?
Okay, I'm just going to wind back a moment or two there, Anthony. So I'll just wind back a few things. One is, you call me an activist and a protester. I lovingly challenge those words. I'm an ordinary person. I know you're not coming at that from a kind of, oppositional point of view. But I object to that language that is used to other us, but ordinary people. I'm a 52-year-old mum who takes non-violent direct action because I believe it's the right thing to do given the situation we're in. So one of the many barriers to more and more people engaging in whole forms of direct action is they don't want to see themselves as an activist. An activist is like another category of person. Identity is so important. So
okay, so how should I describe you?
Well, I'm an ordinary person. I'm a mum. I'm a citizen. I'm someone who cares, who isn't prepared to be passive and collusive in this, facing what we're facing, really, facing reality.
A concerned citizen.
Yeah, thank you, sweetheart. That's loads better, isn't it? And I that's no judgment of you whatsoever, by the way. It's just a conscious kind of noticing that there is so much language, because if activist in the mouths of some people has a certain connotation, and then before you know it, you're in eco crazy or eco mob or eco terrorist and all the rest of it. But coming back to your next question about
last time we spoke, Boris Johnson had described such people as hemp smelling tent dwellers.
Yes. Well, where do you even go with that with Boris? I mean, out of the mouth of a lying, overprivileged narcissist. I mean, where the hell do you go with that, right?
Yes,
but
yes.
What I would say is that, and I'm sure anyone who's any direct contact with Just Stop Oil, Insulate Britain, or Extinction Rebellion, or other civil resistance groups of ordinary people, know full well that these groups are full of really interesting, diverse communities of people. Within Just Stop Oil, people who've taken action from age 15 to 93, 4 generations of people, and are, really varied, from young people and students to carers, electricians, medics, nurses, social workers, teachers, vicars, retired priests, engineers, business owners, and on and on and on and on. It's a cross section of pretty ordinary people doing pretty extraordinary things. Yeah.
Just Stop Oil has got a very specific agenda. It does not want the government to continue to give new exploration licenses for the exploitation of oil and gas resources. Basically, it's keep it in the ground. Very specific, very clear. Do you think that the environmental, perhaps that's not the right word, I don't want to say activist, but do you think that those of us who believe that action should be taken to avert the climate crisis are sufficiently focused in terms of our demands? Rather than saying something must be done, should we perhaps be looking at more specific things and saying, you've committed to do this by 2050, what are you actually doing now? And how are you going to achieve it? Because I think just walking up and down and complaining, there's nothing new in that, and people are getting fed up with it, and people are actually getting quite angry with it in some cases.
Yeah, I think I'd probably agree with a lot of that, Anthony. I think if we go back to 2019, particularly, Extinction Rebellion did an absolutely brilliant job of waking people up, pushing the government and the media, and stretching that Overton window so that the climate crisis and awareness of the climate emergency, and even the language change, or that pushing and pulling the Overton window was massively stretched in 2019, and incredibly successful, the fastest growing climate movement ever, and blah 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 blah. And I think 200,000 people joined in a few months. It was incredible and amazing work, and super proud to have played a little part in that. And at the same time, that Overton window stretch is that very, that really broad stretch of the three demands of Extinction Rebellion, Tell the Truth, Act Now, and Beyond Politics, which is about declaring an emergency, decarbonisation by 2025, which we're clearly utterly failing on, but that is what the science says, if we're honest about it. And Beyond Politics, which is about citizens' assembly, legally binding citizens' assembly, that I think whilst a lot of progress was made in some ways, actually, there is a space for really specific demands, because it became obvious politically that we weren't going to be able to make much more progress on those very broad demands, and they've gone as far as it was realistically going to go, with the massive swing to the right in the politics in this country, etc., etc. So I think having the specific demands, so with Insulate Britain, how blooming sensible does it look now in the midst of an horrific energy crisis, cost of living crisis, cost of greed crisis, if we're honest? That's really predominantly what it is, of course. Insulating and retrofitting our homes, and having a national emergency program to do that, street by street, working through the country. That's so blooming sensible, isn't it? Permanently lowering bills, eradicating fuel poverty, winter deaths, just, eradicating those, creating jobs, and permanently reducing 20% of our domestic emissions. It's a really sensible thing to do. And we still need to do it. And something along those lines, of course, is now incorporated into opposition policy in the Labour Party, which is great. But this government, the Tory government, have gone but even more backwards, if that were possible, on the insulation retrofitting agenda. But in terms of specific, there's definitely a place for really clear, complete no-brainer specific demands. So Insulate Britain, with the two really clear demands as part of that, was very clear, and obviously, again, super proud to have played a little part in that as a spokesperson and so on. And with Just Stop Oil, a really clear demand, as you've said. no new fossil fuel projects, basically, no new licensing consents in the UK for coal, oil, or gas in the North Sea or on land. So yeah, really, really clear. And obviously, it's not even, when you think about it, Anthony, it's not actually even the just up oil demand. It's actually International Energy Agency stated policy as of May 2021, and aligns to the IPCC scientific evidence. Yes, it's not even. You'll know, everyone listening probably knows the Antonio Guterres quote. It's moral and economic madness to continue progress with new fossil fuels, isn't it? And of course, he was right. He is right. Yeah. I mean, if we're honest, which is what I strive to be in respect of all of this stuff every single day, the truth is we've had no carbon budget since 1988. That's the truth, isn't it? When we went past 350 parts per million when I was 18, we've got no carbon budget because negative emissions technologies don't exist and won't exist in the scale that we need in the time that we've got. And probably there isn't enough materials and energy to produce them to make them happen anyway, even if it were possible. Which kind of brings us full circle back to economic growth, doesn't it? And it's super clear to me, and I think not just clear to me, it's factually correct. If we look at GDP graphs against material extraction, materials use, there's a one-to-one relationship. There's pretty much no evidence of any real circularity shift yet. It's pretty much still a wholly linear economy. So materials and GDP, one-to-one relationship, and GDP and energy is virtually a one-to-one relationship, because renewables haven't displaced fossil fuels, they've only added to them. And even when we talk about a virtual, like coming back to your service economy thing, actually a lot of service economy is actually online virtual stuff, which is not virtual. It's based on tech, and tech is hardware and sits somewhere else with these huge server farms and factories, whatever you call it, using enormous amounts of energy and materials. So it's lower energy materials, but it is still energy materials. So that truly low carbon service economy is, me turning up at your house and looking after your cat whilst you do something else. It's informal economy stuff where we do it with our bodies, and come back to how we used to be, X generations ago, when all we had was horsepower and our bodies and carpentry and so on. We had to use what our bodies could do. But as Nate Hagen beautifully describes in his work, that a barrel of oil can do the work of hundreds of people in an equivalent hundreds of people a year. So we've extended our productivity off the scale, and it kind of loops back to your points earlier about standard of living and can we live like this? Well, of course the answer is no. I mean, let's just be really honest about it. Of course the answer is no. But based on work by wonderful people like Julia Steinberger and other people at Leeds University and elsewhere, my understanding is that we could, as a human family, meet basic human needs and still thrive on fair shares, energy, and economic distribution. We just, those of us in the global north, particularly the wealthy in the global north, would have to have drastically different lives. And I'm sure you probably heard the stat that by Professor Kevin Anderson from the Tyndall Centre, that if I think the top, is it top 10% or top 1%? Forgive me, I can't remember if it's the 1% or 10%, but if they come down to the European average carbon footprint per person, so not like a low level of standard of living, but European average, that alone would reduce carbon emissions by a third. It's like a completely bonkers. So some people are going to have to drastically change their standard of living, but that is in order to enable at least a couple of billion people to have a half decent life in human terms. But it brings us back, doesn't it, to what actually a lot of us know in our heart of hearts is things that matter most in life are not what money buys. Providing you've got healthy food in your tummy and you've got a roof over your head, Everything else pretty much is about love and learning and enjoyment and care, which comes back to human contact and care and education. And, isn't it that anyone who's ever lost anyone close to them knows that's the truth? It's love that, we're built of love, we are love, and that's what matters.
Yes, that's quite profound. That's quite profound. Yes, you were saying that, in fact, Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain have been successful, certainly in raising the profile. But there has, on the other hand, been a very, very firm pushback from the government. We've got the new Home Secretary who is putting through legislation to tag protesters, but they're not even protesters, to tag people that they believe may take part in protests. And that must be the ultimate denial of free speech. And even the leader of the Labour Party, who has said that he agrees with the objectives of Just Stop Oil, he has said that we must increase the sentences for people who disrupt roads or glue themselves to public buildings in the name of protest or of concern. So, where do we go from here?
Yeah.
And remember, this is a country where protesters are not actually shot or murdered in their beds. We are relatively civilized, but it's a global problem. And if this sort of thing is increased exponentially across the world, then, well, it's going to be civil war, isn't it?
You can't intervene in a system and not get a reaction back. And it might sound a little bit back to front, but one can take the perspective that the degree of reaction back is a measure of the success. Like, if we come back to some of the other parts of this conversation about power and inequality and greed and so on, then if you don't get a reaction back from the state, you're not actually challenging anything. So the fact that there is this ridiculous authoritarian pushback off the scale, looks more like Russia or North Korea than the UK, that is probably as good a measure of effectiveness as anything else. Really.
So will leg tags and increased prison sentences deter concerned citizens for making their point?
They may, of course, deter some people. They won't deter everyone. It links back to the soup and the mashed potato and the many, many other incredible, amazing, courageous actions that ordinary people and supporters of Just Stop Oil have taken. Many young people as young as 18, 19, 20. And I don't have to say this without crying, but if those people in power, in the government, in the fossil fuel industries, in the banks, etc., if they really think that young people are going to lay down and take this, which is effectively equivalent to lying down and dying, just letting themselves be murdered, letting their futures being stolen from them, letting the pretty small number of people who are consciously making these decisions to drive genocide, letting them get away with it. If they think that that's going to happen, they are beyond naive. We are ordinary concerned citizens, as you said before. And as we've kind of touched on in this conversation, what is utterly naive is to think that you can keep growing an economy on a finite planet and not drive death, suffering, and collapse. That's utterly ridiculous and utterly naive. So, and also what's utterly naive is to think that you can crush a generation and do that in a generation and a time where increasingly people are waking up to this and young people know that this is what's being done to them. If they expect people to just lie down and take that, no matter what they do to people. I mean, look in Iran. Look at Iran. What an incredible female-led, women-led, young girl-led uprising there. I mean, that gives me bloody goose pimples just thinking about it. Young people, particularly women and girls, absolutely incredible. And what if you listen, I heard only this morning a bit of coverage about, and this morning or last night, and the woman who was being interviewed said they've lost their fear. You see, that's what this is about. You have to lose your fear. So whether it's losing your one's fear of in this country of arrest, and actually how you experience arrest, and actually for those of us, for many of us, if we are white, middle-aged like me, it's like arrest is not a bad experience particularly. It's not nice, but it's not really horrific. You can do it and you can come out of it and you can think, oh, that's how they control us with that. It's like the fear of that is, that's not, it's not to be feared. You have to get beyond the fear. But in Iran, it's a whole other level, isn't it? 200 plus people have been shot by the authorities. But they've lost their fear of even dying, because what they're fighting for is so fundamental. And that isn't even for climate per se, although you could say all of these rights are connected, because women and girls' rights are absolutely connected to, interconnected with cross-sectional climate crisis and social justice crisis. So it's about losing our fear. And I think, it might be small numbers relatively at the moment, but it's only going to increase, Anthony, isn't it? So whether it's throwing soup, and let's remember the soup, right? It was not thrown at a painting, it was thrown at a glass covering a painting. And let's just get real about that. There was no actual damage. The painting was back up later that day after they'd wiped it down. Let's just be real about it. And let's just be real about, frankly, as a mother, every single one of these young people are way more priceless than a bloody painting. I don't care about a painting, but I care about my daughter. And I care about every one of those species that's going extinct. And I care about the fact that Oxfam have said every 39 seconds or thereabouts, someone is dying of extreme malnutrition and starvation in the Horn of Africa because of the worst climate drought in living memory, driven by the global north. I care way more about that than a bloody painting. And I care more about sunflowers and real plants, which Van Gogh was trying to depict in that painting, than the painting. We just need to get real. But I think actions like that are so fundamentally important. The creativity and the courage that these young people show is beautiful and is humbling and is inspiring. And particularly things like the throwing paint, throwing paint, there's lots of throwing paint and different things, but I think all of these actions are wonderful. And I have no doubt whatsoever that in the months and years to come, if we are lucky enough to not have had a total societal collapse and we are able to look back, all of these actions will be seen in the same vein as the suffragettes and the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement and so on, because they're totally fundamental and totally essential. And of course, they disrupt us physically and emotionally. They're supposed to, because we have to wake up out of our slumber. We are totally sleepwalking into climate hell and ecological hell and societal hell. And it's all connected. And we have to wake up because we're being driven off a cliff by a tiny bunch of psychopaths and sociopaths. So, we have to wake up. And if governments had done what they should have done and met their primary requirements to protect the citizens over the last few decades, none of us would have to do this. But governments have failed, and that's why ordinary people like me are prepared to get arrested and prepared to go to prison. I myself spent a brief spell in prison last month for literally just sitting on a road, peacefully blocking the entrance of an oil depot. 51 of us were sent straight to prison for that. Some of my colleagues are still in prison for either that or for other peaceful actions. So, no, it's not going to make a difference in the long run. It might might deter some people in the short term, but if you think people are going to just lie down and die, if you think mothers and grandmothers are going to just stop trying to protect their children, they've got another thing coming.
Zoe Cohen, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and ideas with the Sustainable Futures Report. I think we could go on for hours, and I think we should. I think we should talk again. I think we should talk again and see how things change and develop. Can I just, before you go, just ask you one final question? We are all aiming for net zero by 2050. Fine. But what should we aim to achieve by this time next year? And how will we do it?
By this time next year. Oh, right. Well, you know me, Anthony, well enough by now. I don't accept the premise of questions if I don't agree with them. So I go back to the question. Net zero 2050 is bullshit. It's too little, too late, and it's not Zoe saying that. It's the likes of Sir David King and Johan Rockström and others. So if anyone listening doesn't understand why net zero 2050 is too little, too late, please go to the Climate Crisis Advisory Group website. It's a group of the world's leading scientists from every continent brought together by. And also go to the website The Conversation and look up Net Zero is a Dangerous Trap, which is a really, really important piece that came out a year or so ago now, and sets out the utter nonsense that is net zero. And basically, 2050 is too little, too late. We hit 40 degrees in the UK only this summer, which was forecast for 2040, 2050, so like 20 odd years too early. As David King says, all ice on land is now irreversibly melting. So we just need to kind of wake up and accept the truth. 2050 is a joke. We've got to go so much quicker than that. And not only is 2050 a joke, but it's based on, as I think I mentioned before, enormous global scaling up of negative emissions technologies, which isn't going to happen. And the fact that isn't going to happen is accepted by many, many people. And I'd also recommend the UK Fires website, which is leading scientists from UK universities, Cambridge, Oxford, elsewhere. And they set out how we can actually get to real zero using the technology that we've already got. Because if we haven't got the tech now, we ain't going to suddenly develop and scale up something in time. That's just not what happens. But we can do it. I would really recommend, as well as UK Fires, people check out the Centre for Alternative Technology, CAT, which is in the lovely mid Wales, and they've been going for decades. And they came up with zero carbon Britain strategy. We have to ramp up renewables. We have to massively ramp down our energy usage with energy efficiency, taking out unnecessary usage, which comes back to the beauty of degrowth. And we need to change our land use. So in terms of where we should be going for next year, we absolutely must not only focus on individual lifestyle action. If we're doing that, it's an incremental nonsense. So yes, we should do it, but we should do political and direct action as well. I would say there's 3 elements to keep it simple. One is educate yourself. All of the stuff that we've talked about in this podcast and the references to other things, educate yourself. Make sure you really understand why net zero 2050 is a sham, why planetary boundaries are crucial and why we must live within them. Educate yourself. Number 2, yes, adopt personal degrowth in your life. So degrow your own material and energy throughput as much as you can, and keep iterating that. And the likelihood is that you'll probably get happier in the process because stuff doesn't make you happy anyway. I'm conscious I'm saying this in a situation where there are millions of people and families in this country who are increasingly struggling to get by. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, F off, Zoe, I can't put bread. But degrowth is necessary to help you too, because other people need to degrow so we can have a cake that's more fairly shared out. So, it is all in everyone's interests, honest. And so degrow your material and energy throughput, and that's, stop buying new stuff. So do you need any new clothes? If you're more than 30 years of age, you probably don't need any new clothes ever again. Really? So stop doing that, just stop new stuff, end it now. You can do lots and lots of stuff. I mean, all the obvious things, if you can afford to, please get your own solar panels and battery and all of that kind of stuff. Move to a renewable energy provider if you can't do that. All the obvious stuff. For God's sake, stop eating meat, get as near to plant-based as you can. etc., etc. Grow some of your own food if you possibly can. Learn to be a bit more self-sufficient and go down the permaculture route if you can. All of this stuff, it's like, none of it's new. People have been banging on about it for decades. But don't just do that. Please don't just do that, because it's not enough. Please, please, please get politically engaged and get involved in direct action. So support Extinction Rebellion, support Just Stop Oil. And by support, I mean, if you have any privileges open to you, get involved, if you're self-employed and wouldn't lose your job by getting arrested, please join us and get on the streets. Just Stop Oil is a meeting 11 o'clock every day for the rest of October and probably into November outside Downing Street. Get down there and take action, non-arrestable or arrestable action. And if you genuinely can't get arrested for whatever reason, I understand there are people who can't, then volunteer for support roles. There are lots and lots of non-arrestable support roles. Go to juststopoil.org, attend a talk virtually or online, virtually or face-to-face, find out more and get involved. And if you aren't in a position to do any of that, well, hopefully you can go to a talk, whatever, then donate, because we're not campaigns like Just Stop Oil are not oil companies. We don't have massive billion-dollar profits funded and work out of donations, most of which come from ordinary people. So please help civil resistance and don't just sweat the small stuff in your own life, because it will never be enough. It's never been enough. We have to do both. We have to challenge the power holders and make them change, because as we know from COP26 and all of the COPs before that, no one's coming to save us. COP27 ain't going to save us either, so we have to save ourselves, which means changing our own lives, leading in our communities, and driving change through peaceful direct action and civil resistance.
Zoe, thank you again. Thank you once more.
Thank you, Anthony. It's been lovely to reconnect after all this time.
Apologies for one or two glitches in the edit there. That's it for this week. You'll find links on the website to authors and organisations that Zoe recommended you follow up. If you like the Sustainable Futures Report, please tell your friends. If you don't, please tell me. I have listeners all over the world, and there's still room for more. If you really, really like the Sustainable Futures Report, then there is still space for more patrons, and you can find details of that at patreon.com/SFR. As little as £1 a month or $1 a month is much appreciated and helps to ensure that the Sustainable Futures Report is independent and ad-free. Many thanks to all my listeners, and in particular to all my current patrons. That was the Sustainable Futures Report. I'm Anthony Day. Until next time.